It's a Tuesday. It feels like a Monday. And yet we have our friend Bill Marsh Jr. in studio. He's got a great blog. It's called Making You Matter. And it's one of those things where, you know, Bill, I've told you this before. Sometimes when it comes to self-help and self-improvement, sometimes I can go, ooh, I don't want it to be cheesy.
Yeah.
Please don't tell me things like, you know, I don't ever want to feel like it's something that is out of my comfort zone with the cheesy level.
Yes.
And you don't have that.
Oh, thank you.
It's it's the kind of advice that makes a lot of sense. It's easy to add to your existing life. And you don't feel like you need to, you know, sing Kumbaya when you're doing it, you know?
Well, thank you. I try to give good insights that can make a difference.
Definitely good insights. Now, the last time you were on the show, I was under the weather, and you were sitting with Colleen, and you were going through a couple of reasons and a couple of ways to make better decisions. And I think this is so perfectly appropriate since it's graduation season.
Yes.
And part of growing up is to make mistakes and learn from them, right?
Yeah. In many ways, you think about it, in many ways, the quality of our lives reflects the quality of our decisions, right? I mean, all of us can look back on certain decisions we made, good and bad, and see how they shape so many aspects of our lives.
Oh, yeah.
You know? In many ways, we are the product of our decisions. But as I was sharing, we'll just kind of maybe do a brief review of the last time that knowing that when you look at humanity's sort of track record of decisions, the kind of decisions people make, and the quality, we don't have the greatest record. Now, I use some examples, like from history, from the workplace, and from our personal lives. Like, for example, if you look back in history, I mentioned Napoleon's decision to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States for 22 cents an acre. Like, what was he thinking, right? It was great for us, not very good for France, right? Or Kodak's decision after inventing the digital camera to pretty much ignore it, which led to their demise, right?
Yeah.
Like, how did that happen? In our work lives, a recent study showed that 44% of lawyers would not recommend a career in law. That's a big number.
That's huge.
In our personal lives, 60,000 tattoos are reversed in this country every year. That's a lot.
I can understand that. Hey, I thought it was a good idea to have a neck tattoo.
Like, what were they thinking,
Nope.
right? 90% of New Year's resolutions are dissipated by the end of January, right? And you can look all down the line that despite having so much knowledge and information available to us, we don't always make the best decisions. So why is that? And so I referenced a book, a great book by two Stanford professors. They're twins, Chip and Dan Heath, and they published a number of wildly successful books over the last 15 years, and one of them was called Decisive. And in it, they unpack 4 what they call villains, or 4 obstacles that keep us from making good decisions. And I unpacked the first 2 in the last session. And the first sort of what they call a decision-making villain, is what we call narrow framing. And what that means is we tend to, when we make, especially making big decisions, psychologists call it the spotlight effect. We tend to zero in on only one alternative, right? And oftentimes that causes us to miss many more viable options that are out there. So I'll give you an example. Since we just came off from World Day weekend, we were just saying how nice the weather is. Let's say somebody's driving by the bay this weekend. They see all these boats out in the bay, right? And they say, boy, wouldn't it be really nice for our family to have a boat? So maybe they get home and they see a boat ad on television, and they really get excited about a boat. I've done this before. And you go to the boat dealership and you look at these shiny new boats, and pretty soon you and your spouse are saying, your decision becomes, should we buy this boat or not?
Or not.
It becomes a whether or not decision, right? And that boat may be a good decision, but according to the authors, and I think it's a really good point, what you want to do is what they call widen your options. So the question isn't whether or not to buy that boat. The question is, what are some other things we should consider that could create lasting memories for our family, right? So maybe it's a camper. Maybe it's a timeshare. Maybe it's a dream vacation. Maybe it is a boat or a pool or something. But we tend to get, I think it's because we're sort of neurologically programmed to simplify things, to make things simpler. And so the advice there is, anytime you come across a whether or not decision, right? look at ways that you can ask yourself, what are some other options that I could consider?
And Bill, is it also, kind of an indication that it's not just you want the boat, you wanted the memories. You want to spend time with your family.
Yes.
So even going beyond the thing,
right,
to figure out, okay, why do I want this?
What's our motives? What's behind that?
Narrow framing. Yeah, that it does become we're going to have a boat. We're a boat person or not a boat person.
Yeah, I've made that decision in hiring candidates. You know, you try to hire a person and you only get a few. Maybe you put an ad out there and you only get a few candidates. And maybe you get one qualified candidate. Instead of going back and looking for more qualified candidates, you go, should I hire that person or not? It becomes that narrow frame. And oftentimes that leads to a decision that isn't just the best decision, and you can regret that.
Yeah, right.
So that was the first one. The second villain or obstacle is something we all have, and I think we can all resonate with, and that is what the authors call confirmation bias.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So confirmation bias is defined as the tendency we all have to embrace information that supports our beliefs, right, and reject any information that refutes them, right? They also call it believing is seeing. So, and there's a lot of examples of this, especially in, I think, of sports and politics, right?
Yep.
So if you're, let's say, we'll use football, for example. If you're a Michigan State fan and they're playing and there's a call, there's a controversial penalty, there's a big penalty call in the field, your affiliation, whether you're rooting for whichever team, is going to drive whether that's a good call or a bad call.
It's
right?
impossible to be impartial when you love something like
yes,
that. Yeah,
it is. If it goes against Michigan, that was a horrible call.
Yeah.
Michigan people, it was a good call. Or look at politics. Like, how many liberals do you know watch Fox News consistently, or conversely, how many conservatives watch CNN consistently? Right?
Really good point.
We tend to live in echo chambers, right? And those networks know that. They make their living by writing stories and offering analysis on things that already confirm what their listeners believe.
Well, it's also, anthropologically speaking, we want to be around people who think and look and act very similar to us,
yes,
right?
we do.
That's just kind of what it is. So
we do.
We're going to look at things that support the things we already believe.
Or how many times, if you notice on the news when articles come out that point maybe in one study that there's health benefits to drinking alcohol or dark chocolate or coffee, right? We picked that one story, right? Because we want it to be true.
Yeah. I actually was just reading a story that said that it's almost like torture to start work before 10 a.m. No, it's a ridiculous study, but me being on a morning show, I was like, oh yeah, see? There's my confirmation bias. We should all start at 10 a.m.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
And that's so common, and we all know that. So, but oftentimes we let it get the best of us. So the antidote to confirmation bias is what the authors call reality testing your assumptions. And it's simply this: when you're making a significant decision, surround yourself with people with different perspectives, right? Perspectives that will often challenge your thinking, right? And that's not easy to do because we don't like the discomfort of being challenged, right? So have people in your life who maybe see things differently from you that can challenge you, right? And reality test, right, those assumptions that underlie your decision.
Okay.
I use the example this goes back hundreds of years. The Catholic Church in the 16th century, the church canonizes saints based upon their moral life, the quality of their lives, right? And they had a process they started in like 1587. They called it the promoter of the faith. And the job of this person was to argue against that candidate, right? To look for things the reasons why they shouldn't be candidates, right? It also became known as the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
That's where that term came from, right? What's interesting is after 400 years in the 1980s, Pope John Paul II abolished that office. And since that time, candidates for sainthood have been canonized at a rate of up to 20 times faster.
Right, because nobody's vetting.
So you're not having that not to mean that they don't deserve to be saints,
sure.
but the point is that when you have people in your lives who are reality testing your assumptions, who are providing that challenging thinking, that are looking for things that can help offset your natural confirmation bias, it often leads to much better outcomes.
Yeah, I guess so. It also shouldn't be that easy to be a saint.
No, it shouldn't. You're exactly right.
Let's move on to the other two then.
Yeah, so there's two more. So
I like this villains option. Yeah, this is great.
So in addition to narrow framing and confirmation bias, the third obstacle or villain is short-term emotion. And again, this is one that we can sort of resonate with because and just like confirmation bias, it's really unavoidable. Like every decision we make is governed by emotion. In fact, in recent years, psychologists and neuroscientists have found that every sensory input we have travels through our limbic system, which is where emotions are all stored. Every single sensory. So we experience literally everything emotionally before we experience things rationally. Right?
So before it even, wow, I did not know that.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That's where the whole emotional intelligence movement came from. And certainly that includes our decisions. In fact, recently there was a neuroscientist by the name of Antonio Damasio who studied people who underwent significant brain injury to their limbic system, to the area of their brain where emotions are stored.
Okay.
And what he found that depending on the severity of the injury, they all had something peculiar in common, that they couldn't make decisions. They could describe what they should do in sort of logical terms, but when it came to making decisions, they found it impossible to make even the simplest choice. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Right? And the point is that, we may use reason and logic to sort of reason ourselves toward a decision, but the actual decision-making process is governed heavily by short-term emotion, right? And so I think understanding that, what the authors call the antidote to that from their perspective, and I think it's so true, is to attain distance before deciding. So to sort of separate yourself from that decision, and especially when it comes to making, like I think of, like I'm in the car industry, which is a big ticket emotional item, right? Or boat. We were talking about boats, or houses or vacation destinations. Those things that can really get your emotions going, right?
Oh yeah,
and cause you. In fact, top salespeople understand this. People who are really, really experienced in sales and big ticket items know that if they can get people to stop thinking and start feeling, that their chance of getting that sale goes way up.
Okay,
right.
But in this circumstance, short-term emotion is a villain.
It's a villain. Yes, yes. Now,
I mean,
for
it's great
salespeople,
for
salespeople, it's kind of it's a tool that they use. But if you're making that decision, you have to be aware of that.
Yeah,
right. So the antidote to that is as I mentioned, is to attain distance. And a good example of that is there's a woman named Susie Welch who you may have heard of her. She's a frequent guest on MSNBC on their financial programs, and she wrote a book a few years ago with a very simple title. It was called 10-10-10. And the whole focus of the book is it teaches you to think about your decision in 3 different time frames, right? So she asks you, if you're making a decision, she asks you, how would you feel about that decision? A, 10 minutes from now. B, how about 10 months from now? And C, how about 10 years from now?
Right? Ooh, wow.
So the value, and here's the value of that. It helps to level the emotional playing field, right? Instead of being so shifted towards the emotional intensity. We tend to overemphasize the present, right? At the expense of the future. By shifting our spotlight to 10 months or even 10 years into the future, right? It helps to keep what we're feeling right now in perspective instead of being so heavily weighted, right? So you think about that. I mean, think of how the further out you extend the potential impact of your decision, the less important your present emotions seem.
Right. Okay.
That's where that leveling the emotional playing field, that makes a good point. So, for example, let's say that you are contemplating having a difficult conversation with a loved one. Maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a coworker, an employee. And it's a tough decision because they're not going to want to hear it. And there's a lot of discomfort and fear there, right? Well, if you apply that 10-10-10 model, you ask, well, 10 minutes from now, it might not be much of an impact. But how about 10 months from now? How would you feel about that? And chances are you'd probably feel relieved, maybe even proud that you had that decision.
Okay.
Or 10 years from now. Or, I've had this happen in our business. Or if you're a business owner, maybe you're chasing after a really good candidate for your company, and you know this person is the right move and can make a big difference in your business. You know, do you overextend the compensation package to land that person? Because you know, right now, you need that person badly, right? And there's often the temptation to do that, right? But then ask yourself, well, what impact will that make on maybe the culture of our company 10 months or 10 years from now, right? And if you really analyze that, and she does that really well in the book, it can really help you deal with this short-term emotion that's part of everything, every decision we make.
No, I think oftentimes when I'm looking at this or listening to this advice, Bill, I often think of personal reasons. So like you were talking about conversations with your spouse or your children or things like that. But in this circumstance, I wonder how important this is for managers to understand split-second, short-term emotional decisions can be very harmful for your company.
Absolutely. Yeah. In leading people, in hiring people, in making sort of moves with people, in connecting with people, you're exactly right. And because they experience things emotionally as well. But oftentimes it's either the fear, right? It's that idea between there's short-term fear, but there's also long-term regret.
Yeah, right.
And you really have to balance those two.
This is, my grandma used to always tell me, she would say, any big decision, sleep on it, you know?
Yeah.
And is that kind of distancing yourself a
Yes,
little bit?
it
to
is.
Just, hey, you are really excited about this right now, or you're really, whatever that might be, take a breather, get away, sleep on it, and then come back.
Yeah, and I think like we used the boat example, for example, that you may ask yourself, well, what about, you know, the season for a boat is maybe 3 months long. What about how's that going to impact? How's this going to impact us, you know, next year, year after that? And start looking at those, and then you may well come around to deciding to buy it, whatever it is, boat, car, whatever. But you've done it after analyzing some of the different time frames and the potential consequences of it. And that's a good, that sort of dialogue can really help you overcome that. You know, because nobody wants, they call it cognitive dissonance. Nobody wants to, you know, wake up from, you know, buying that boat and then a week later saying, oh, geez, this was a terrible decision.
Buyer's remorse.
That's awful. Nobody wants to deal with that. And so addressing those issues and having that conversation and putting yourself through that frame, which all revolves around that distance, sleeping on it, talking it over, I think is really important.
And the final
one,
obstacle.
yeah. And this one really is after you've made the decision. Is the authors refer to it simply as overconfidence. So you know, you encounter a choice, you analyze your options, you make the choice, you make the decision, and then you live with that decision. But oftentimes, we tend to be overconfident about how the future unfolds, right? We tend to be overconfident about our ability to make good decisions, right? So here's some examples, some humorous examples. In 1962, Dick Rowe, who was a prominent talent scout at Decca Records, after sitting through an audition by a young four-man rock and roll band named the Beatles, told them, here's what he said, and I quote, he said, "Sorry, boys, four-piece bands with guitars are finished."
Oh, no.
Now, think about the...
Oh,
Do you think he regretted that decision?
I think so, yeah.
Maybe not 10 minutes from now, but certainly 10 years, 50 years from now, right?
Yeah.
Or in 1927, Henry Warner of Warner Brothers Studio famously said, "Who the hell wants to hear actors talk?" Another regrettable decision.
Yeah,
right?
I would say so.
More recently, and then this has been repeated in survey after survey, 88% of American drivers consistently rate themselves as above average. It's impossible, right? I had a guy, I heard a guy one day, he's a speaker, and he goes, if I ask this question, how many people, I go into a room of 500 people, say, how many people here would rate themselves above average? Nearly everybody as a driver, right?
Yeah.
We all tend to overestimate our competence there.
And we probably overestimate like our spouse's driving abilities too, or underestimate.
Yeah.
But he's a terrible driver, but I'm great.
That's exactly right, yeah. Or here's one that's really, that caught me too. 2 out of 5 men who profiled themselves in a popular online dating site answered yes to this question. Would you rate yourself as a genius? I mean, maybe that's 1 in 10,000, right? Right? 2 out of 5. It's like, oh,
yeah, I'm
man,
a genius.
I don't want my daughter dating that person.
Overconfident.
So we tend to be overconfident in the decisions that we make. And so the antidote to that is simple. It's prepare to be wrong. Oftentimes we make decisions without really thinking through what happens. What happens if this isn't the right decision? Having some people call it a tripwire or a process by which, or a consequence or a thought through plan. If this isn't the right decision, how are we going to deal with this? And it's very popular. Some of the best examples are in American business. So, for example, and oftentimes businesses will ask themselves, what kind of insurance can I take in order to be prepared for for failure? Not buying insurance policy, but what sort of insurance what sort of moves can I make? And this often shows up, I mentioned, in hiring mistakes, which if you own a business or you're part of a business, you can have long-term lasting consequences. And so more and more companies are creating what the authors call what they call a tripwire in the recruiting process. And a good example of this is if you applied for a customer service position with the online shoe retailer Zappos.
Yeah.
Have you heard of Zappos?
Yeah.
Pretty well-known company.
Yeah, very well.
At some point, and you were offered the job, which is a very difficult job to get because they hire strongly for cultural fit. At some point during the training, towards the end of the training, you will be offered $4,000 to quit.
Wow.
And that isn't that interesting?
That is interesting.
$4,000. And here's what the authors say in the book. The offer manages to make everyone involved a little happier. Departing employees leave happy because of the check. Zappos execs are happy because they avoid the far more expensive prospect of managing people who aren't a good fit.
Right.
Even the employees who turned down the offer are happier. They've put a stake in the ground. I'd rather be here than take the money in a way that feels good.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
That's
and
really
it's not just Zappos. There are more companies. I was having breakfast a couple of months ago with a friend of mine who works for a large auto dealer group based in the upper Midwest. And they do the same thing. They don't offer, I think they offer $1,000 during training at some point because they realize that, especially in sales, if this person doesn't go into it with a sense of confidence and doesn't feel the right fit, the cost can be huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So the big idea there is when you're making a big decision, think through what if this isn't right? What if this doesn't work out for us? How can we overcome it? Right? Can we make it work?
Yeah.
And if not, then that's going to impact the decision that you're making.
I know that this is because we've gone through some of these villains or these obstacles in making good decisions and kind of in the last couple of sessions here, from narrow framing to confirmation bias to short-term emotion and overconfidence. Where does the expression trust your gut come from then? Because that's another thing that I've heard often, which it's when you're in the middle of a big decision and maybe you're doing all of these things like you're sleeping on it and all this other stuff. Whether you want to call it your conscious, your whatever it might be, there is something that people have that if it's not right, you feel it.
Yeah, and I think that's true. But I think we tend to overemphasize the trusting your gut.
Yeah.
Right? And I think what's really good about what the authors have done here and what they focus on and the point they make is that you can't divorce all these things like the confirmation bias and the short-term emotion, but have a process for making decisions. So when you're making a big decision, lay these out and you just look at them. How can are we narrowing our frame too much? Is it becoming a whether or not decision? What impact is confirmation bias affecting me? Should I get better other perspectives? So have a series of tools that you can sort of plug into your decision making. And so at the end of the day, if you do, there is a role for trusting your gut.
Yeah.
Or if you're a spiritual person, praying about it, right? And I think that's important, but that shouldn't be the only factor. And I think that's the value of we haven't been taught. They don't teach in school. They don't teach in school a process for making better decisions. Right?
Well, maybe they should.
They probably should.
Yeah.
Because again, going back to the assumptions that drove this conversation is, in many ways, we are the products of our decisions.
Now, we've been talking about these kind of big decisions, but can we employ some of these things in little decisions? I mean, I often think about something that you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, that we can all look back and say, hey, I'm really glad that I made that decision at the time, or boy, do I regret that and I wish I had gone another way. And at the time, it didn't feel like a big decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think being able to discern what could be a big decision.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I think you can overdo that if it's where we're going to go tonight for dinner. You can spend a lot of time thinking.
We don't have to go through these 4 things.
I mean, I think there's a certain truth to the bigger the decision, the bigger the role these things play, because potentially the longer consequence. But you're right. Sometimes a little decision about, we've told our kids, your decision about who you get in the car with at the end of a party. As a teenager or whatever, or even as an adult, can be a decision that can be life or death.
Yeah.
Right. So sometimes it's just thinking through things.
Right.
So
using that old limbic system too.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love that.